3 people are alive on the entire planet. That is it. Adam, Eve, and their son Cain, who just minutes earlier bludgeoned his own brother to death in a fit of jealous rage, becoming the first murderer in human history. That is the complete population of the earth at this exact moment in the story of Genesis. And then, only a few verses later, without warning, without introduction, without a single word of explanation, the text casually mentions that Cain has a wife and that she is pregnant with his child. No backstory, no name given for her. She simply appears. For centuries, skeptics have seized on this exact detail and used it like a loaded weapon against the entire book of Genesis, delivered with a smirk across a dinner table or a college lecture hall, treated as an unanswerable knockout blow that supposedly proves the Bible cannot even keep track of how many people exist in its own opening chapters. And here is what almost none of those confident critics ever admit, because admitting it would mean they never actually finished reading the very next chapter. The answer to where Cain's wife came from is sitting in plain sight in the same book, only a handful of verses away, spelled out directly by the same author accused of forgetting it. This is not a case of Christians scrambling for 2,000 years to invent a rescue for an embarrassing gap. The rescue was never needed because there was never actually a gap to begin with. There was only a reader who stopped one page too soon. This particular question has earned a kind of legendary status among the long list of supposed Bible difficulties, and it has earned that status honestly because of exactly how deceptively simple and devastating it sounds the very first time you hear it. It gets treated, and treated correctly, as the textbook example of what a biblical contradiction looks like on its surface. The go-to illustration used again and again by serious defenders of Scripture, precisely because it is so common, so often repeated, and so widely assumed to be unanswerable by people who have genuinely never checked it against the text for themselves. Out of hundreds of hard questions raised about the Bible over the centuries, this is the one that keeps surfacing as the prototype. The question practically everyone eventually runs into. The one that quietly separates people who have actually opened Genesis and read past chapter 4 from people simply repeating a talking point secondhand, passed down from one confident voice to another without a single one of them stopping to verify it. And that fact alone should stop you cold, because if the single most famous, most repeated, most confidently delivered objection against the reliability of Scripture turns out to collapse, the moment you read one more chapter, it raises an uncomfortable question of its own. How many other supposedly devastating objections you have heard over the years were resting on that exact same foundation of nobody bothering to check? So let's lay the actual challenge out in full, honestly, the way a sharp skeptic would present it, because pretending it does not sound compelling at first would be its own kind of dishonesty. Genesis tells us that God created Adam and Eve, and that they had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. Cain, consumed by jealousy, murders his own brother. At that precise moment in the narrative, exactly 3 human beings have been named anywhere in the text. Adam is alive, Eve is alive, Cain is alive. Abel is dead, killed by his own brother's hand. 3 living people and 1 corpse make up the entire recorded population of the earth. And yet, only a short distance later in the same chapter, the text states plainly that Cain settled in a land east of Eden called Nod and had relations with his wife, who conceived and gave birth to a son named Enoch. A wife materializes with no introduction whatsoever, no explanation of her origin, as if the author simply forgot to mention where an entire second human being came from. On the surface, that looks like a genuine and serious internal inconsistency, exactly the kind of detail that makes a careful reader stop and wonder whether the author of Genesis lost track of his own story. This is a completely fair question the first time you encounter it, and waving it away with an eye roll instead of a real answer would be its own form of intellectual laziness. It deserves to be taken seriously and answered directly, not dismissed. But here is where the mystery stops being a mystery and becomes something closer to a lesson in the simple discipline of reading carefully, because the very same book that raises this apparent problem resolves it within its own pages, and you do not have to search far to find it. Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 states plainly that Adam, after the birth of his son Seth, lived another 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Sit with that sentence because it directly and completely answers the question everyone treats as unanswerable. Adam and Eve did not have only 2 sons. Genesis was never written as an exhaustive birth registry cataloging every single human being who ever lived. It is a historical narrative that names the people relevant to the specific story being told, the individuals whose actions move the account forward, the ones whose lineage matters for what comes afterward. Cain and Abel get named because their conflict sits at the center of this account. Seth gets named because his line eventually leads toward Noah and everything that follows. But that selective naming does not mean Adam and Eve stopped having children after those 3 sons. The text tells us the exact opposite, directly and without ambiguity. They had many more sons and daughters whose individual names simply were not considered essential for this particular narrative to record. And once you factor in exactly how long Adam actually lived, the picture becomes almost embarrassingly obvious in the best possible sense. According to Genesis chapter 5, verse 5, the total span of Adam's life was 930 years. Let that number actually register, because it reshapes the entire timeline in a way that a rushed, careless reading of Genesis completely misses. 930 years is a staggering length of time in which Adam and Eve, the only 2 human beings on earth, carrying the direct command to be fruitful and multiply, would have had enormous opportunity to produce a very large number of children, well beyond the 3 specifically named early in the account. It requires no leap of imagination once you actually run the numbers to picture dozens of children being born to this couple across nearly a millennium, each of those children eventually reaching adulthood, marrying, and starting families of their own, steadily expanding the population generation after generation. The question of where Cain found a wife quietly assumes, without ever stating it out loud, that the entire population of the earth at that point numbered exactly 3. But the biblical text itself never makes that claim. That assumption belongs entirely to readers who stop at chapter 4 and never make it to the plain statement in chapter 5, confirming that Adam had many more sons and daughters. The problem was never buried inside Scripture. The problem was a reader closing the book 1 chapter too early and mistaking their own incomplete reading for a flaw in the text. So the most reasonable conclusion, requiring no speculation beyond what the text plainly says, is that Cain married one of his own sisters, or possibly a niece, if by the time Cain reached marrying age, some of his older siblings already had daughters grown into adulthood. Either scenario fits comfortably inside the timeline Scripture provides, and neither one requires inventing a single detail the Bible does not already imply. This is not a patch stitched on centuries later by uncomfortable theologians trying to cover an embarrassing hole. It follows directly and naturally from information Genesis provides just 1 chapter after the supposed problem shows up. The wife was never a mystery imported from outside the story. She was one of Cain's own siblings or extended family, already present in the world the text describes, simply unnamed because the narrative had no specific reason to record her name. Now, a sharper and more determined skeptic tends to shift the objection at this point rather than let it go entirely. And this second version deserves just as much honest attention as the first, because on its surface, it sounds like an even bigger problem. If Cain really did marry his own sister, or a close relative like a niece, does that not mean the very first family in human history was built on an act the Bible itself explicitly condemns elsewhere? Later in Scripture, in the book of Leviticus chapter 18, God gives Israel a detailed set of laws forbidding sexual relationships between close relatives, laws that classify that kind of union as incest, morally forbidden under the law given through Moses. And there is a second layer stacked on top of that, rooted not in ancient law but in modern biology. Everyone today understands, at least broadly, that children born from unions between close relatives carry a significantly elevated risk of inheriting serious genetic defects because relatives are far more likely to carry matching copies of the same harmful recessive genes. And when two carriers of the same defect have a child together, that child faces a much higher chance of being born with a serious inherited condition. So this version of the objection lands with real weight. If incest is condemned by Scripture and dangerous according to basic biology, how can the entire human race trace back to a union that checks both of those boxes simultaneously? Notice how this objection often gets delivered too, not as an honest follow-up question, but as a triumphant one, as if answering the first challenge only exposed a deeper, more damning problem underneath it. It deserves to be met at full strength, not a softened version of it. This is where the second layer of the answer comes in, and it needs to be walked through with the same care as the first, because it resolves the objection completely once you actually follow the reasoning instead of reacting to the initial shock of the claim. The very first point is chronological, and it matters more than people usually give it credit for. The command forbidding marriage between close relatives, recorded in Leviticus chapter 18, was given to the nation of Israel through Moses at a specific point in history, roughly 1,500 years before Christ. That means thousands of years separate the time of Adam and Cain from the moment God ever issued that particular command to anyone. In Cain's actual lifetime, no such prohibition existed anywhere. There was no divine command on record forbidding marriage between close relatives, because that command had not been given yet. Applying a law given to Moses' generation backward onto people who lived and died long before that law ever existed is not how moral accountability works anywhere else in Scripture, and it is not a fair way to read this text either. God's moral instructions to humanity were revealed progressively over time, not delivered all at once at creation, and holding Cain guilty of breaking a rule that would not exist for many centuries after his death is not a coherent charge to bring against him, or against the reliability of the account describing him. But the chronological point is really only the doorway into the far more compelling half of the answer, the part that directly addresses the biological fear rather than just the legal one. Here is the insight the text itself makes possible, and it deserves to land with full weight rather than being glossed over. When God created the very first human being, Adam, he was formed in the image and likeness of God, complete and fully functioning, without flaw. There were no genetic imperfections present in the human race at its very beginning, because the human race at its very beginning consisted of a being freshly formed by his Creator, not a being descended through generations of accumulated biological wear. The genetic defects that concern doctors and geneticists today, the very defects responsible for the elevated risks tied to close relative marriages in the world we live in now, entered the picture as a result of the corruption that followed the fall, and that corruption only built up gradually, across long stretches of time, generation after generation, as small errors compounded slowly over the centuries. In the earliest days of humanity, in the days of Adam's immediate children, that accumulated genetic damage simply had not built up yet. The population was, in effect, still working from something close to its original, uncorrupted starting point, which means the biological danger we now associate with close relative reproduction, a danger created specifically by the slow buildup of shared genetic defects across many generations, had not yet had the time to develop at all. It is worth pausing here and letting both halves of the answer sit side by side, because most people who raise this objection have never once been given the chance to see them together like this. On its own, the mention of incest sounds alarming, almost engineered to make a listener recoil before they have had time to think it through. But that alarm depends entirely on quietly assuming that today's moral and biological conditions applied identically at the very dawn of the human race and that assumption simply does not survive contact with the actual timeline. The law came later. The genetic risk accumulated later. Neither one existed as a meaningful factor in Cain's world, and treating them as though they did is not a discovery about the Bible's inconsistency. It is a failure to account for the difference between the world as it exists now, after thousands of years of accumulated law and accumulated biological wear, and the world as it existed at the very beginning, fresh from the hand of its creator. Once that distinction is actually drawn out instead of glossed over, the moral weight behind the objection quietly evaporates, and what remains is a coherent, historically grounded account of how the earliest human family expanded into a wider population in a world where no other option was ever available in the first place. Consider, too, how strange it would actually be if the objection worked the other way around, if Scripture had somehow described Cain marrying someone from an entirely unrelated bloodline out of nowhere, with no explanation of where that second family came from. That version of the story really would raise a legitimate population problem, because it would require an entire second set of ancestors the text never once mentions, an unexplained second origin for humanity existing quietly alongside Adam and Eve. Instead, the text does something far more consistent and far more restrained. It tells a single, coherent origin story, one man, one woman, one expanding family tree, and it lets every later marriage in that earliest generation follow naturally and necessarily from that starting point. The very feature skeptics point to as a weakness, the fact that Cain's wife had to come from within his own family, is in fact a direct and required consequence of the story holding together as a single, internally consistent account of where the human race began. A contradiction would have looked like some other unexplained population appearing from nowhere. What we actually have is the opposite of that, a single population, growing exactly the way you would expect it to, given the plain terms the story sets for itself from the very first chapter. There is a third and final piece that ties this whole case together with almost mathematical simplicity, and stating it plainly closes off any remaining wiggle room a skeptic might try to find. According to the account given in Genesis, the entire human race began with a single original couple, Adam and Eve. That is not a minor detail sitting on the margins of the story. It is the entire premise of the origin account being told. If that premise holds, even just for the sake of argument, then it follows with total logical necessity that every person alive during that earliest generation, including every one of Cain's potential marriage partners, had to be a close relative of some kind, because there was, quite literally, no other category of person available anywhere on the planet. There was no neighboring village with an unrelated family Cain could have approached. There was no separate population descended from some other original pair for him to marry into. Every human being alive at that moment in history descended from the exact same two parents, which means marrying anyone at all, by definition, meant marrying someone within that same immediate family line. This was never some avoidable choice Cain made recklessly, while better options sat available, and he simply preferred convenience over caution. It was the only possible arrangement built directly into the structure of a story that begins with one man and one woman as the entire population of the human race, criticizing Cain for marrying a close relative in a world where every single available marriage partner on the entire planet fell into that exact same category, is not identifying an inconsistency in the text. It is simply failing to think through what the premise of a single original human couple actually requires as its unavoidable consequence. Take a step back now and look at what has actually happened over the course of walking through this properly, because there is something here worth sitting with beyond just the mechanics of the answer itself. What began as one of the most repeated, most confidently delivered challenges against the reliability of Scripture dissolves completely. The moment you do the one thing almost nobody bothers to do before repeating the question, which is simply read the very next chapter. The population problem disappears the instant you reach Genesis chapter 5 and its plain statement that Adam had many other sons and daughters across a 930-year lifespan. The moral problem disappears once you recognize that the law forbidding close relative marriage belonged to a specific moment in redemptive history, thousands of years after Cain was already gone, a law that cannot fairly be applied backward onto a period before it existed. And the biological problem disappears once you understand that genetic corruption accumulates gradually over long stretches of time, meaning the earliest generations of humanity were not carrying the same inherited risk that concerns us in the world today. 3 separate objections, each one sounding devastating in isolation, and all 3 resolved by information sitting directly within the same book that raised the question in the first place. There is something genuinely worth feeling proud of in all of this, something that goes far beyond simply winning an argument with a skeptic across a dinner table. This is not a case of Christians desperately patching together an explanation centuries after the fact to save face for an embarrassing gap in their own holy book. The explanation was written into the text from the very beginning, sitting in plain sight, available to anyone willing to keep reading, instead of stopping at the first uncomfortable verse. And there is something quietly, righteously infuriating about how often this exact question gets weaponized as an easy knockout blow against faith, tossed out with total confidence by people who, in nearly every case, have clearly never opened Genesis chapter 5 for themselves, repeating a talking point handed down secondhand, rather than a genuine textual difficulty they ever actually investigated. Think for a moment about how many believers have quietly carried an embarrassment about this exact question over the years, nodding along politely when a friend or a professor raised it, feeling a flicker of doubt they never voiced out loud, assuming that because they did not have an answer ready in that moment, none must exist. That embarrassment was never necessary. It was built entirely on missing information, not on any actual flaw in the text, and once the missing piece is supplied, the discomfort has nowhere left to attach itself. There is a real difference between faith that has never been tested and faith that has been tested and found to hold. And this question, as small and almost comical as it sounds stripped down to 4 words, offers exactly that kind of testing ground. Anyone willing to walk through it honestly, checking the very next chapter instead of stopping the moment things feel uncomfortable, comes out the other side steadier than they started, holding a small but real reminder that the text consistently rewards patience over panic. And there is a wider lesson folded inside this one narrow case, worth carrying into every other hard question Scripture eventually raises. What looks, on the surface, like a devastating gap or contradiction, again and again turns out to be a matter of readers stopping too soon, assuming too quickly, or projecting standards from one era of history backward onto another era where those standards simply did not yet exist. That does not mean every difficult question about the Bible resolves this cleanly or this fast. Some genuinely require patient study and careful attention to historical and linguistic context before an honest answer comes into focus. But it does mean that the mere existence of a hard-sounding question, delivered with confidence and a smirk, is never by itself proof that the text has failed. Sometimes the entire weight of an objection rests on nothing more than an assumption sitting quietly in the background, never checked against the very next page. The question of Cain's wife has earned its reputation as the classic Bible difficulty precisely because it teaches that lesson so cleanly and so completely. Read one chapter further and an entire population problem, an entire moral objection, and an entire biological concern all dissolve together, exactly where they were waiting to be found the whole time. So the next time this question comes up, whether from a stranger online, a coworker looking for an easy way to dismiss your faith, or even from your own quiet doubts late at night, you already know exactly where to look. You know that the answer was never hidden, never invented after the fact, and never something to feel embarrassed about not having ready in the moment. It was there the entire time, 4 verses away in the same book, written by the same hand, waiting patiently for anyone honest enough to keep reading.